Hi again everyone. Thanks as always for the feedback that you shared on the previous episode of Railway. Today we'll be continuing on the theme of how to use my blank station asset to detail railway stations in existing environments. This time focusing on something a little less urban and more in the industrial space. This is a build that has been inspired by the Docklands Light Railway, or DLR, in London. The DLR is a railway network that serves the massive redevelopment that took place in London after the docks were closed following the containerisation of international shipping. Entire shipping basins were filled in, massive warehouses converted to flats, and a brand new financial centre was built where massive amounts of goods once were loaded and unloaded. It's a perfect example of how brownfield and disused industrial areas can find new life. As always, the first thing I'm doing is to lay out the station itself. I'm using the Railway Replacer mod to make sure that the tracks for the station match with the tracks that we want to use on this length of railway. Here I'm using the fine movement control of Move It to ensure that it lines up perfectly with the existing track. Simply hold down Control as you click and drag to activate this feature. The network I'm using here is a Bienvenüe London Third Rail Decorative Network by Revo. This network is designed to be used with any existing railway track type to add third rail electrification. There are some networks that have both the tracks and the third rails included as one, but because I want to use a style modelled after London's DLR itself, I'll have to add them manually. If you turn on the road guideline snapping option, they will align perfectly. Each network comes in pairs, a double for running down the middle of twin tracks, or if you want to go for added realism, these single third rails can be used to bend and curve with the tracks as they approach a crossover. With any third rail electrification, it is possible to have neutral sections where short lengths of track don't have any adjacent contact rail. This is because the vehicles will have pickups at both ends, or on each car, which means that even if there's a short section that's not covered by contact rail, there is still at least one other point still connected. I'm now setting up the superstructure of the Overbridge that will form the paid-for area of the station. Initially, I was toying around with the idea of the connection coming from the upper roadway here, but quickly abandoned that, as this is actually a pretty grotty industrial roundabout with a connection directly from the motorway. Not too many pedestrians will be using this footpath to get to or from anywhere. So I quickly changed this around to focus back on the factory district here instead. I've created the main surface using ploppable pavements, and now I'll use ploppable grass to act like a stencil while I edit the shape slightly in procedural objects. I'm using these animated escalators to make sure that I've got the height difference between the platforms and the overbridge nailed, but I'll come back to show you how they work a bit later on. I'm now laying out the platforms and using a neat trick that works on any network that has a tiled pattern or mesh. You may have noticed that this tiling begins to get squeezed as you approach the end of an edge node. You can counter this by adding a tiny additional segment at each end, and using Snap It within Move It to practically hide it. This is one of the techniques I'll show in more detail in the wash-up video I do after these time lapses. Here I'm adding a bit of detail to the area where the old track was lifted, removed and replaced by the modern track to support the new DLR line, creating a break between the old and the new. I'm now starting to build out the details of the passenger overbridge, and will use some of the Berlin awnings by Army Polizeifunk. They're some of the best that we have for creating glass curtain walls. They're flexible, varied, fully compatible with PO, and the awnings can be used in a range of different ways to give you a modern effect. After resizing them down to something that will fit between the two escalators, I'll quickly move them back into place and align them to the base of the superstructure. In building this structure, you'll see how I use a number of different elements to create something that, cliched as it may be, is greater than the sum of its parts. To create the walls, I'm actually using concrete motorway barriers that might look out of place to begin with, but once I add a few more details, you see that it really does work. You don't really need to go into this level of detail if you don't want to, but I'm using PO to adjust the edge of the barrier so it aligns flush with the escalator. Here, I'm modifying one of the larger concrete block assets to provide some heft to the structure that sits beneath the pedestrian deck I laid out earlier. This is to dial up that realism again, as you wouldn't ever see a structure of this size have such a physically thin surface area to hold up the roof, walls, and the people walking on it. Always consider whether what you're building will need a supporting structure of any sort, and don't forget to include it. Here's where I begin to build the supporting beams that will lift and support this overbridge. These are actually pillars from a tram network available in the workshop, but they're perfect for the look I'm going for on this station. Here, I've chosen to try and leave as much of the existing railway intact as possible. This would have been a goods siding, or the terminal end of a goods line built to either serve the factory or warehouse alongside, or act as a stabling yard for freight cars. While I've chosen to try and keep some of these, you may prefer to get rid of them entirely. It's up to you really, and both are perfectly valid. The roof I'm using here is from Ronick 69 and is a fantastic asset. It's actually a station platform roof. Here I'm using it as a modern structural roof, but you'll see that it doesn't quite fit with what I'm doing here. So, after a few bits of trial and error to see what will work, in the end I find another solution. As in the last episode, I still haven't completely gotten out of the habit of jumping around. I'm now finishing off the glass screen I started earlier when I laid out those motorway barriers. Sometimes I want to try and build things like the roof to get a better idea of what I might like to do with some of the other supporting infrastructure. Maybe if I chose a different approach for the roof, I would want to have more beams around the side to support it. But here, because the roof is supported by beams towards the middle of the walkway, I'm free to keep the outside edges light and without any of those heavy components. Here's where I add that final bit of protection for this end of the walkway. I'm using another piece of the same Berlin awning kit and the vertical support beams included in it. I'm going to use PO to edit the height of these beams and then use the copy function to move them into place. To activate this, just hold down Control while you click and drag, and then keep it held down when you let go of your mouse button. Having added in the glass, it's time to look at the finishing touches, including the animated parts of these escalators. One thing I've not put in here, which goes against what I said in the last episode, is that there's no level access from the street to the platform. To be quite honest, it's because I spent about 20 minutes trying to get Ronix's lift asset working, and it just wasn't playing nicely. So in the end, I just gave up and decided to move on, but I have gone against one of my own rules here. I built something that wasn't accessible. It also doesn't realistically match up with the type of station, which is a modern post-1990s development, which would have had accessibility requirements baked in by law. Really, that's entirely on me. Here I'm trying to find a simple to use but modern looking entrance. This is an early access asset from Titan's Patreon, modelled on a central bus station in Bienvenüe, Germany. I'm just modifying it here, stretching and tweaking and shrinking and changing it to fit a little better into this space. What I want to try and do is to make it big enough to be a realistic entrance and cover the escalators I have there, but also try and fit it into the footpath space that I have. I try to move around the road, and that doesn't really fit with the rigid block layout that I have for this street, but through the use of PO, you can quickly modify the size and shape of these structures and really bend them to your will. Here, I'm using more of the same TFL roundels from episode 2. On the DLR, they're generally quite a bit bigger and are used to make a statement. These stations are in areas that you might not typically expect to find access to public transport, so when those stations were built, nice big DLR roundels were included to make it very easy to see where the entrances to these stations are. As we get towards the end, it's time for some finishing touches. As I said in episode 2, key things are somewhere to sit, somewhere to keep you out of the rain, and somewhere to toss your rubbish. Here I'm going to do a bit more text customization using procedural objects, focusing on the passenger information displays. To get this looking good, I'm starting with the text I actually want and superimposing it over the text that's included as part of the asset's texture. Once I've got this as I like it, I'll then add a coloured rectangle to cover up what was already there. In this build, I've created the terminus station, so there is typically, although I'm not going to say always, but there is typically no service from one of these platforms, even though it is built as such. This is to provide resilience during service disruption, or if there are problems on the other platform like a broken down train, or if there is an event nearby, making the station particularly busy. But there's none of that at the moment, so in this situation, I've got these signs saying not in use. Finally, as with any custom station, you will need to wire up the pedestrian paths, enabling access between the street and the platforms via any structures that you've built. As you would have seen, I've anchored the pedestrian path at one end, and that is key for allowing Sims to pathfind their way into the station. Although I'm using the vanilla pedestrian path to begin with, I do actually switch to building this via invisible pathways, which I admit is not particularly helpful for the demonstration. You'll see that I have to convert one leg of this back into visible pathways when I want to try and get the correct slope down the escalators, before finally flipping them back to invisible paths once I'm done. And I think this is the final piece of the puzzle. I'm creating a station entrance sign. These are the same that you'll see either on remote entrances like stairways over tracks, or the main entrance buildings themselves. They're made up of a small DLR roundel in the corner, a turquoise solid bar, and the name of the station in that white New Johnson font, making it very, very clear where the entrance or access to the station is. For the station name, I've chosen Granary Lane to reflect the former industry that may have been in this area, first lending its name to a street, and then to the station itself. As always, I'm using procedural objects to customize the text, and I'm playing about with the X and the Y values to try and align the text exactly where I want it to be. And there was where my game crashed. Thankfully though, it was at the very, very end of what I was doing. Nonetheless, I reloaded and redid the work, but you will see some subtle differences between what I created on camera and what you'll see in the cinematics. So, let's leave it there for today. Enjoy the before and after shots of this customized station, fitting in very nicely with its surroundings, and demonstrating how you can use a blank station asset to squeeze in a realistic piece of transport infrastructure that really looks the part. Once again, thanks for watching. Please do hit me up with feedback, questions, ideas for future topics, or techniques that you want me to cover in detail. My thanks as always to the fantastic creators who kindly supplied video footage for use in the opening credits. If you're working on something that you'd like to see included, as always, leave me a comment or grab me on Twitter. But until next time, it's bye for now.